Welcome to this week's Sunday School lesson. We've been talking about leaving our assumptions about the Bible behind and having an altitude adjustment, kind of seeing the Bible big picture as it stands within the context of a book, the whole Bible. Also, it's a culture of the time. What's going on in the world as these stories are being written? So, we've also talked about how God's love and vision is almost always broader and more inclusive than we can possibly imagine. So today I thought I'd talk about something that seems to suggest the exact opposite. Jesus says, "Small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." So what do we make of that? First, Jesus' words about gates and roads come at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, a collection of sayings, kind of a long teaching found in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. So why does that matter? Well, because Jesus lived in the midst of a socio-political stew that had people seething with anger and aggression, completely different than today. Well, it was different in a lot of ways. The Roman army was occupying their land, the latest in a long line of oppressors to march in and make their lives miserable. Worst yet, these conquering Romans didn't acknowledge the God of Israel, let alone believe in that God. Can you imagine what that did to the collective Jewish psyche? Can you see the questions that this might have raised? If our God is the one true God of the universe and we are God's chosen people and this is God's land, why does it seem like we always lose? That people keep coming in and taking over and making our lives miserable and they don't even acknowledge God? How does that work? There were a number of responses to the Roman occupation, one of the more popular being, "Grab your swords, let's go kill them." Many believed the only proper response to the Roman occupation was to pick up swords and drive out the Romans with violent resistance. Can you see how there would have been tremendous tension in the air when a charismatic rabbi teacher leader showed up and gathered a crowd and started teaching about a kingdom of God? No wonder people came from miles around to hear him. It was a volatile time and people were desperate for direction and answers and leadership. Now here's where things get interesting. Jesus understood that if they did pick up swords and start fighting, the Romans would crush their revolt with brutal force and finality. It happened before. Every time there'd been an uprising, the Jewish people just got stomped out. The one time the Jewish people basically beat their oppressors in the story of the Maccabees against the Seleucids and Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and that's where the whole story of Hanukkah comes in. That was like their one good shot at revolt. Otherwise, they lost a lot. Kind of like the French army here lately. In other words, Jesus knew that the broad path, the popular path, the road a lot of people were itching to take would only lead to destruction. Are you following me here? And that's what actually happened. 40 years after Jesus, there was a rebellion, and the Roman general Titus marched in and leveled Jerusalem to the ground and looted the temple. So what is Jesus doing here on the Sermon on the Mount? He's calling his tribe back to their destiny, reminding them of their calling to be a light to the world. That's Matthew 5:14. Hearkening back to what we talked about last week, even with Abraham before, that God has called this tribe to be a blessing to all the nations. You are to do things differently. He's warning them that the broad path will only lead to destruction. He teaches them about a different kind of kingdom, one in which your heart is transformed as you become a person of character and courage and compassion. He talks about humility and generosity and not being judgmental and keeping your word and practicing nonviolence and not worrying and caring for the poor. He's giving them practical, profound, brilliant wisdom about how to make your way in a complex and confusing world in which people are constantly clamoring for you to join their cause, to go their way, to take the path that appear attractive but will actually lead to destruction. That's really the whole story of the Sermon on the Mount. Here is a different vision of life. It's going to be a lot harder. It's not going to be as popular, but ultimately, it'll be better. So when Jesus talks about a narrow way, what do you think he's talking about? Look around. Do people usually take the narrow, difficult, more costly way of becoming a person of courage and nonviolence and love? Or do they often settle for revenge and bitterness and cynicism? Do we use fear tactics because it's easier? Do we put other people down? All these things are sometimes the easy way, the way the world expects nations and leaders and people to act. And Jesus is saying, I have a different vision. Not too many people are going to take it, but it's the right way. But what about those who say he's talking about believing in him, that he's the narrow way? Yep, they're right. But which is it? Which interpretation of the passage is the correct one? Was he talking about not joining a violent revolt? Or was he calling Israel back to its original calling? Or was he teaching how to become a particular kind of person? Or was he talking about believing in him? See, that's the beauty of Jesus' teaching. There's so much going on in just a few words. It's like that precious gem with the many facets of a diamond. Every time you look at it, it reflects and refracts the light just slightly differently. You always see something a little bit different. So I want you to think about the things that matter most in life. They all take a tremendous amount of time and energy and focus. Think of an athlete who decides she's going to be the best she can possibly be. In order to do that, she has to put in hours of training and competing and has to get plenty of sleep and eat certain foods. In other words, she has to say no to lots of things in order to say yes to being the best athlete she can possibly be. It's the same with marriage or being a parent or working a job. If you're serious, then you have to give yourself to that person or task or work, and that always requires discipline and focus. To say yes always requires saying no to other things. This is why some people never reach their full potential. They don't say no enough. They refuse to go through the very difficult process of narrowing how they exert themselves and spend their energies. I mean, it sounds nice to keep your options open, but if you want to do something great, at some point you have to say no to those options because you said yes to this one thing you're focusing your energies on. So is that what Jesus is talking about? Yeah, among other things. See, the power of the Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus steps into a volatile political, religious situation and offers a new vision of life calling his audience back to their destiny, giving them very practical examples of how to come evil with goodness, inviting people to trust him that God is doing something new through him, something that will change your life. The Sermon on the Mount is really this completely different vision of living. And if you read it without that larger context, it maybe loses some of the power because things were going bad in Israel for the average everyday person. I mean, they were under threat of the Roman army all the time. They didn't have much freedom. Everyone wants to do something different. You should do this. You should do this. This is the way we need to lead our country. No, this is the way we need to lead our country. And everybody's getting pulled in all these directions. And Jesus enters into that and says, you got those options. Here's an even more narrow one. It's going to take a lot of focus, a lot of time, a lot of sacrifice. But this road, this way of living leads to life. And I know it's hard to turn the other cheek and walk the extra mile and all of that. I know it's hard to believe that blessed are the meek and the poor in spirit. It's a hard way to live. It's not easy. Most people can't live in that humility, in that generous life, in that first shall be last, last shall be first way of thinking, that giving, that sacrificial way of living. That's why the road is narrow, because it's hard. Jesus asks us to do hard things, but he doesn't ask us anything he doesn't do himself. He's always on that road with us. It may be a narrow road, and yet, here's the paradox of faith. As narrow as that road is, there's enough room for everyone who's willing to take it with Jesus.